Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're looking at a profound, deeply moving historical account recorded in Shoghi Effendi's book, God Passes By. We're exploring a moment of ultimate sacrifice, an event that didn't just shake the foundations of 19th century Persia, but literally sent ripples around the entire world. So let's start with a question to really frame our journey today. Why is it that certain moments in history continue to inspire people, generations, even centuries later? Like, what actually gives a person the courage to face unimaginable suffering without ever abandoning their message? To find out, we're going to travel back to the turbulent 1800s to witness one of the defining moments in the early history of the Bahá'í Faith. Our story centers on a figure known as the Báb, which is a title that translates to the Gate. Emerging in Persia back in 1844, he announced the coming of a completely new spiritual age, essentially preparing the way for Baha'u'llah. And you have to remember, 19th century Persia was a place with incredibly entrenched religious and social expectations. So, by proclaiming a new era, the Báb was offering this revolutionary vision that fundamentally challenged the entire status quo. And things moved fast. Staggeringly fast. From his initial declaration in 1844, the Báb's message sparked a massive, almost immediate expansion of followers. But, as you might guess, that rapid growth brought intense friction. The religious and civil establishment saw this movement as a severe threat, and that triggered a wave of violent opposition, ultimately culminating in the Báb's public execution in the city of Tabriz, just 6 years later, in 1850. The source text we're looking at describes the final phase of his ministry with these really heavy words: a fast-ebbing life, so crowded with the accumulated anxieties, disappointments, treacheries, and sorrows. The authorities had reacted to the Báb's teachings with devastating force. It was literally a hurricane of persecution, sweeping away many of the Báb's most capable, devoted, and heroic followers. The human toll was just staggering, leaving the Báb in deep mourning in his prison cell. So we have this ultimate clash of forces building up. On one side, you have the Báb's peaceful, spiritually focused mission, and on the other, the state's violent suppression. The Grand Vizier of Persia watched this massive spiritual awakening sweeping across his realm and came to a pretty grim conclusion. He believed the only way to stop this dynamic movement was the complete, brutal extinction of its founder. What's really crucial here is how calculated his next move was. Dispensing with explicit orders from the Shah himself, the Grand Vizier orchestrated a highly controlled sequence of events. First, he issues an independent order. Next, because he fears an uproar in the capital, he has the prisoner transferred to the city of Tabriz. And finally, he hastily secures the necessary death warrants from the local clergy. The stage was officially set for a public execution. But the events that followed, they totally defied all earthly logic. Right before the execution, the Báb was having a final confidential conversation with his secretary. Suddenly, the chief guard abruptly interrupts them and tries to pull the secretary away. The Báb turns to him and delivers this incredibly powerful assertion. He says, "Not until I have said to him all those things that I wish to say can any earthly power silence me." It was a bold promise, and it was about to be tested in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Outside, the atmosphere in the barracks square was incredibly tense. Even the man actually tasked with carrying out the execution, Sam Khan, a Christian colonel of the Armenian regiment, was seized with dread. He actually approached the Báb and begged to be released from this grim duty, fearing the wrath of God. The Báb calmly assured him, promising that if his intention was truly sincere, the Almighty would relieve him of his perplexity. Still, Sam Khan had to proceed with his orders. The Báb, alongside a young, fiercely devoted companion named Anis who had literally begged to share his fate, were suspended by ropes against a wall. And then, 750. That is the staggering number of rifles leveled at them. 3 files of soldiers, 250 men each, stepped forward in the square. Shoghi Effendi's account describes what happens next as a scene of absolute chaos. As each file of soldiers opened fire, 750 bullets were discharged. Now remember, these are black powder rifles, so the smoke from the volley was so incredibly dense that it completely darkened the sky. It entirely obscured the courtyard from the 10,000 spectators who were watching from the surrounding rooftops. But then, the wind shifted. And as the smoke finally cleared, the astounded crowd beheld something their eyes could scarcely believe. The Báb had vanished. Only his companion remained there, standing completely unharmed next to the wall. The ropes suspending them had been completely severed by the bullets, but the prisoner was just gone. Immediately, the crowd erupted into this frantic, frenzied search. So, where did they find him? Back in the exact same room he had occupied the night before. He was perfectly unruffled, sitting there completing that exact interrupted conversation with his secretary. When the terrified chief guard found him, the Báb calmly greeted him and said, "I have finished my conversation with Syed Hussein. Now you may proceed to fulfill your intention." The guard, remembering the Báb's promise that no earthly power could silence him until he was finished, was so shaken he instantly resigned his post and fled the scene. Sam Khan, the colonel, was shaken to his core too. Remembering the Báb's reassuring words from just hours before, he realized he had been relieved of his duty. He immediately ordered his regiment to march straight out of the courtyard, swearing that even at the cost of his own life, he would never, ever again repeat that act. But the Grand Vizier's orders still stood. A new regiment, the bodyguard, volunteered to step in and take their place. Once again, the Báb and his young companion were suspended against the wall. As this new regiment prepared to fire, the Báb spoke his final words to the gazing multitude. "O wayward generation, had you believed in me, every one of you would have followed the example of this youth. The day will come when you will have recognized me. That day I shall have ceased to be with you." It was this profound, heartbreaking reflection on humanity's tragic failure to recognize a spiritual message when it's standing right in front of them. The second volley found its mark. The tragic deed was completed. But the historical record notes a deeply moving detail here. While their bodies were shattered by the bullets, their faces remained remarkably unmarred. The source text draws a really powerful, direct parallel here between this immense spiritual gravity, the youthfulness and meekness of the Báb, the swiftness of his ministry, and the public affront he sustained, comparing it to the passion and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And the immediate aftermath was marked by some truly remarkable natural and historical upheavals. The very moment the shots were fired, a blinding gale of dust swept over the entire city, blotting out the sun until nightfall. Down in Shiraz, a devastating earthquake struck. As for the prime instigator, the Emir Nizam, he met a violent death within 2 years. Even the regiment that fired the fatal shots suffered their own tragic mutiny and execution shortly after. Now, the authorities ruthlessly exposed the remains by the city moat to prove their victory, but the story was far from over. Devoted followers orchestrated this daring, incredibly dangerous rescue in the dead of night. They safely concealed the remains in a wooden casket, moved them in complete secret to Tehran, and protected them for decades. Eventually, they were ceremoniously entombed on the beautiful slopes of Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, which is where they rest today. The impact of this martyrdom rippled way beyond the borders of Persia. A French scholar and government official who lived in Persia at the time recorded this, a magnificent example of courage that it has been given to mankind to behold. He went on to say that the Báb sacrificed himself for humanity, sealing the pact of universal brotherhood with his very blood. Honestly, the global reactions were astounding. Intellectuals, diplomats, and artists all across Western Europe and Russia were deeply, deeply moved. A French Orientalist called the events a veritable miracle. Playwrights in St. Petersburg and Paris, including folks in the circles of Tsar Bernhardt and Leo Tolstoy, wrote entire dramas and poems about his sacrifice. They recognized it not just as a Persian tragedy, but as a universal symbol of unyielding spiritual courage. And this brings us to the core meaning of this entire history. The story of the Báb is this profound reminder of the contrast between the darkness of violent persecution and the inextinguishable light of a new era. The civil and religious powers of the time really believed that by extinguishing his life, they could destroy his teachings. But instead, that sacrifice acted as a massive catalyst. It transformed society and proved that spiritual ideals simply cannot be destroyed by violence. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left to ponder a timeless, deeply personal question. The story of the Báb invites us to look inward and ask, when humanity encounters a new light, a transformative truth that fundamentally challenges our old ways of thinking, how do we respond? Do we resist it out of fear, or do we have the courage to investigate and embrace it? Ultimately, this remarkable piece of history proves that true spiritual light, once it's kindled through pure sacrifice, will continue to illuminate the world forever. The darkness of that barracks square back in 1850 could not extinguish the Báb's message. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. It leaves us with one final, powerful thought. If such an undeniable light was born from such profound darkness, what other transformative truths are just waiting for us to discover them?